My name is Fernando Buitrago. I'm head of marketing at Privado, and I'm here with Nishant Bhajaria, who's a leading expert in the field of data privacy. He's author of the book Data Privacy, a Runbook for Engineers, and he's accompanied by Brandon Brooks, who's global head of privacy at Morningstar. They'll be having a conversation regarding their experiences in privacy and creating the business case for privacy that goes beyond compliance at times. So it should be a really great conversation. Before I hand it off to them, I want to tell you that Privado syncs privacy compliance with the software development lifecycle, from design to code to testing and deployment. With Privado, you can ensure software products meet privacy requirements without needing to slow the pace of product development. So if you have any questions about Privado, do reach out to our team. Feel free to explore our website at privado.ai. And we're recording this presentation, so we'll email it to everybody after the event. And do ask your questions as they come up. Just type your question in the Q&A section, and Nishan and Brandon will be addressing them during their conversation. So that's all I had to say. And Nishant and Brandon, please take it away.
Thank you. And we have a question, and I know somebody wants to enable the chat. Just want to make sure you're aware of that. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Brandon, for joining us this morning. We have been doing this webinar series for a bit of time now. The goals are multiple. We want to set up a privacy engineering community that is aware, and this doesn't just include engineers. We include attorneys, product managers, project managers, compliance experts. The goal is to educate people based on the knowledge and experiences of the folks on the panel, tell you what we have done that has worked, lessons learned, etc. And the goal is to make sure that we have a more educated, a more sophisticated community so that we can do privacy the right way without hurting the business and without creating unnecessary process. So the goal is to have a lot of our experiences guide yours. We have a software engineering community on Slack that Fernando is going to send the link for so that you can join the community and become part of the dialogue. You can hopefully join us in a future panel as well. So we're not necessarily trying to sell you anything on this call. We're trying to upskill everybody at the same time. So with that being said, Brandon, would you love to introduce yourself and give us a sense of who you are, what you do, etc., how you got to privacy?
Yeah, of course. Well, first off, thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm Brandon Brooks. I am the head of privacy at Morningstar. Morningstar is, I think at its core, an investment research firm based out of Chicago, but we're a global company based in, I don't know, or we operate in 30 or so countries. So within Morningstar, privacy is split between legal and information security. So I head the team of lawyers that does privacy at Morningstar, but we also have a privacy operations team and a privacy program team that sit under InfoSec. Before I got into this role, I guess I'll go back to law school. I had an academic interest in privacy, but I focused primarily on labor law. But I was interested in workplace surveillance and the intersection of privacy and labor law. And then, when I graduated in 2011, there weren't a lot of dedicated privacy jobs. And so I worked as a labor attorney and then ended up doing tech transactions for a while. And when I was in those roles, I just continued to pursue, I think, an interest in privacy. And then eventually moved over here to Morningstar, where I continue to work in a commercial role. But 4 years ago, I moved into this role as the head of privacy.
That was amazing. Thank you, Brandon. And a few things jumped out to me as you were answering my question. The first is the sheer diversity of the roles you have open within your company for people who work in privacy. I think that that's a great sign, because then people can get in the domain in multiple ways. You don't have to write code. You don't have to have a JD. There are multiple other roles as well. And your own evolution is also extremely inspiring as well. So let's make that our first question. So how do people get into privacy? Like whether you are in the company or from the outside, what experiences do you look for? Like if I were to send you my resume right now, Brandon, what are some of the skills you look for in terms of making sure that I can add value and bring practical value proposition to your company? So how do people get into a role like yours or on your team?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think like anything else, demonstrated experience or interest is helpful. So I guess maybe I'll start on the latter part. I talk to young lawyers or compliance people or people who are new to the field. It's probably a better way to put it. And one thing that's interesting that is appealing to me is, as someone who's hiring, is whether or not somebody has pursued skills. So even if you are not working full time in privacy, if you're getting, certifications, or if you're moonlighting as, as someone in a privacy role in your company, I think that's really useful. But yeah, I mean, I think it's also, role specific. And so, if you have somebody, say on the tech side, if you have somebody who knows data, and has kind of a good skill set at the intersection of understanding how to manage data, maybe ethics, that's helpful. On the legal or compliance side, it's kind of the same thing. You want somebody to have those hard skills when it comes to governance or understanding transactions or stuff like that. But at the same time, has shown developing skills in privacy.
One thing that you didn't mention that has historically been part of my calculus is, do people know the organization? So I had to start my privacy
Yeah.
program at Nike under duress of a consent decree. So in many cases, I prioritize not necessarily privacy domain expertise, but the fact was, can this person help me get into these meetings? Can they help me understand what a certain team's position is? So I think over and above all the skills you mentioned, I also wanted to add one more thing for the audience at large. When you establish a privacy program or when you run a privacy initiative in your company, you want to balance that domain expertise with people who understand the organization. Because when you join a company or when you become a privacy expert within the company, people often look at you as a blocker. They often look at you as sort of a legal agent or somebody who's going to stop things. So I think it's important for you either to hire somebody or build that expertise so that you augment your privacy antenna to sort of organizational judgment. Thoughts about that, Brandon?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I like cross-functional problem solving is so important. Understanding the organization and how data moves, but also just understanding how to make things happen within a company. Like I think within my role, one of the challenges is just building the relationships with the appropriate stakeholders in the company who can who can serve as allies for the privacy function. But yeah, I mean, anybody who is in the product org or in the tech org or infosec or anything like that understands how to solve problems that don't fit neatly within, one functional area, is, that's valuable for privacy.
And something else we're seeing in this age of efficiencies, we're seeing a lot of consolidation. We have seen Microsoft lay off its AI ethics team. We've seen Google let go of Keith Enright, who was the chief privacy officer at the time when I was at Google back in the day. So we're seeing a lot of consolidation happening. And it's not that companies care more or less about privacy. It's more the fact that privacy is now subject to the same cost efficiencies that other domains have been subject to. So in my case, I'm seeing privacy engineers get very, very improvisational. They try to build allies preemptively to make sure that they add value to the company, even outside the context of a race. So as an example, historically, privacy engineers and even privacy attorneys have said, do X or GDPR will bite you, do X or CPRA will bite you. So it's been privacy buy-in has come by way of maybe a combination of threats and fear. But now we're seeing privacy professionals say, if you improve privacy, it's going to improve quality of data, it's going to reduce attack vector, it's going to improve throughput, etc. So have you, Brandon, seen that happen in not just in your company, but across the industry with your network as well? Like, are you seeing privacy engineers and attorneys make arguments not just based on law or compliance or enforcement, but based on organizational improvement? Have you seen that pivot happen? Is it more or less what you thought? And by the way, I want to make sure people in the audience understand this. We typically have a lot of guests on this webinar from the New York, Silicon Valley area. Brandon comes from the Midwest. So my hope is he represents a perspective that is different. So I would strongly encourage people to take notes. He may have a perspective that's very different from the one we typically get on this call. So back to Brandon.
Yeah, I think my perspective is a little different. I'm going to reframe the question a little bit.
Sure.
So as far as adding value from, whatever insights about data that we have through data mapping or, the other activities that we're doing, that value is there, but I'm not sure that I'm the best person to make that argument. But I think one of the things that we do is we try to be really careful to ensure that the stakeholders that we're working with understand that we are here to support their business objectives. We are not just here to say this is, these are questions of legal compliance or say financial or legal risk. Rather, we are here to help you achieve what you're here to achieve. I mean, at the end of the day, we work for a company. The company's here to make money, and we are here to ensure that the product folks or the marketing team or whatever is able to do their job. And so I think a lot of that is relationship building, and earning trust or building trust with the folks that you work with. But I think one of the things that that I've found is that our goals and the goals of the teams that we work with aren't necessarily incompatible. I mean, I think I think they're frequently compatible. So if, for instance, we want to offer a product in a new market, we need to ensure that, we've met our obligations to, under consumer privacy law in that market. Or if we're developing a new product, and we get some pushback on the amount of privacy work that happens during the product development process, it's often convincing to say, or it's often helpful to remind the business team that this is going to not only help you develop a better product that is consistent with our brand, but it's also going to be helpful in the commercial sense because our clients are going to want to know what we've done to build privacy into this product. So I think as far as making the argument for privacy, I think there is often a more positive spin than we've traditionally seen.
And I think that's pretty fantastic because I want the audience to understand that there are ways to make this alignment happen that don't derive purely based on fear. So that is very helpful.
Yeah.
One change I've seen in the last 10, 15 years is not change necessarily, but a constant, like what should the org structure look like? As an example, like when I began my career at Nike in privacy, I reported in the chief privacy officer, and at the time people would wonder, why does a CPO who's an attorney have so many engineers under her? That was a big question. I think over the span of the last 15 years, we have seen those questions go away. We've seen privacy reporting structures span the full gamut. Like we've seen privacy reporting to the legal team, the CPO. We have seen privacy reporting to the CISO, as I used to back in my time at Uber. We have seen privacy reporting to product management, as was the case when I was at Google and Meta. So I have seen every single combination possible. And what happens is when privacy reports into legal, you have the benefit of being separate from the company a little bit. You have that level of protection, objectivity from a privacy perspective. Like the legal team is not governed based on how much they ship. At the same time, to Brandon's point, we as an employee of a company, you have to keep the company's interest in mind as well. Because if there is no business, there is no data. If there is no data, there are no customers. If there are no customers, there is no business, right? So you have to be agile and flexible in that regard. So Brandon, my question to you is, have you seen what kind of reporting structures have you seen from a privacy perspective, and what has worked and what hasn't? Any insights there?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you about our experience. So when I started in this role, there was the head of privacy, or the chief privacy officer, which I think was the title before. And then everything in the privacy organization reported through the chief privacy officer, who reported to the general counsel. And so we had privacy managers and privacy operations, privacy program management and privacy operations all reporting through legal. A couple of years ago, we split. And so I retained the lawyers on the team, but as far as privacy program management and privacy operations, we moved that over to InfoSec, and we did that for a couple of reasons. The first is I think what we found was that as we were building out our organization, we were looking at a scenario where we were going to build redundant silos with InfoSec. So when it comes to a lot of the operational work, from doing DSAR requests to responding to due diligence questionnaires or performing due diligence, there are functions within InfoSec who have similar skills already and are more mature. And so what we decided was that it would be smarter basically to continue to add resources to that InfoSec team where there's experience and experienced managers, and sit privacy operations and program management there. It works though, because I think we have, between me and the CISO and between our respective organizations, we have a strong working relationship, but I could understand that maybe being different in different organizations.
And I think what happens is when you find a way to intelligently share resources, you are creating a better privacy program. As an example, there are things the security team thinks they are doing, what they may not be doing, and it becomes easier to accomplish those goals if you sort of pair them up a little bit, right? At the same time, it creates challenges because there are differences between security and privacy. Like if the security team, for example, builds a scanning software, they scan for specific threats like DDoS, account takeover, etc. From a privacy perspective, when you're scanning code, you're trying to understand what happens if this code, and this data come together. Those are contextual risks that are not privacy, that are not security specific. As an example, when Cambridge Analytica was happening at Facebook, it was totally legal from a security perspective. Like the API had been signed off on. What they were doing essentially was, rather than just taking one piece of data, they were taking several small chunks of data, bit by bit, query by query, and then collectively creating a privacy risk. So there are examples where security risks don't level up to that degree, but the privacy harms are pretty substantial. So I think what I would tell people, I think what Brandon is saying as well, is to be very flexible, very nimble in terms of reporting structures, but also in terms of roles and responsibilities. So you want to identify risk more holistically and then decide, is it owned by engineering, is it owned by security or privacy, and then come up with a strategy to essentially mitigate it using automation. So I think reporting structures are a means to an end. What you don't want to do is like shape the reporting structure in a way that keeps people comfortable. What you want to do is shape the structure so that people feel that they have visibility and they have the ability to fix privacy problems before they become a big harm. Uh, have you seen any efficiency related pressures in the industry? So not talking about your company, Brandon, but for in your group in Chicago, like in the Bay Area, we're seeing a lot of push to make sure that security and privacy share resources. Have you seen that happen? Are you seeing it more or less in the last couple of years?
Not necessarily, but I say that with the caveat that we're pretty lean as it is. So I'm speaking from my company. I haven't necessarily seen that, but I think efficiency drive is driven by the resource crunch that both InfoSec and privacy have.
Fantastic. So the second phase of this webinar is we're going to talk about relationship building. So we've talked a lot about cross-functional problem solving, but when you want to work with the engineering teams, you want to work with the PM, AI, GS teams, platform teams, it's critical to ensure that there is a culture of privacy. So there's a question from Tess Frazier, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. How do you build a culture of privacy, which we have found speeds the adoption of privacy initiatives? So what Tess is very cleverly pointing out is that if you're going to adopt privacy across the company, some of it comes down to culture. So culture is one of those things which is hard to quantify. It's like saying you have a good culture is like saying I have a good sense of humor. I cannot self-certify if I tell a joke and people laugh. That proves I'm funny, but I cannot advertise the fact that I'm funny, right? As much as I would like to. So, Brandon, you want to go first? How do you build a culture of privacy? How do you know it's working? How do you know it's not working? Like, what does culture of privacy mean to you? How do you go about it?
Yeah. I mean, I think to start, I am fortunate and probably more fortunate than a lot of my colleagues where like I work for a company where we take like our brand of being a trustworthy or responsible partner pretty seriously. And so over my time here, I've fought my battles, but I don't fight a ton of ethical battles when it comes to whether or not we should do something. And I think that's, in privacy, especially on the legal side, there's always there are the hard questions of whether or not we can do something, but then there's the harder questions about whether, okay, we can do this, but should we do it? And is it consistent with what our customers expect? Um, but I think more directly to the question, I think awareness and getting yourself in front of as many of your colleagues as you can is probably the most effective thing you can do. And also from a control and a risk standpoint, that's really important too, because you can publish all the governance that you want, you can put technical controls in place, but if you don't have a sophisticated workforce that understands the why, that this is something that we should be doing, then there's still going to be gaps because I think really like 90%, excuse me, 90% of risk comes down to just decision making and human judgment. And so I think awareness through training or relationship building or again, making the case for privacy to other decision makers, but your peers in sales or product or whatever, I think that's super important.
Let me give an example because I think the feedback we've gotten from people on these webinars is they love actual examples. So I'm going to give an example here
Sure.
to add to the fantastic points Brandon just made. So during my time at Meta, which ended earlier this year, my team built consent platforms that are extremely flexible. So historically, consent platforms were governed to do no harm, which is like add as much copy as possible, add a link to the privacy policy, which most people don't read. And when people click on the privacy policy, it's impossible for them to make sense of it. So the consent UI that Meta had built was very, very limited, was very, very fitting to Meta's needs. But then we have the Digital Markets Act or DMA, which is a pretty consequential law when it comes to privacy. But a lot of jurisdictions are using the DMA to not just look at privacy, but look at the idea of are you building a monopoly? So essentially, it's 1999 all over again, except in that case, it was the DOJ going after Microsoft. In this case, what's happening is you have multiple jurisdictions in the EU going after US companies like Meta, like Google, to say, you have a huge platform, you have all of these apps running on the same platform, you have these apps sharing data, and you're creating a culture of dependency where you simply cannot go anywhere as a customer. So with Amazon, I have a lot of shopping history on Amazon. It is impossible for me to download that shopping history and take it to eBay because it's the Amazon platform just works very differently. So what my team essentially did was we built a consent platform that was extremely flexible. So to say, you are now leaving marketplace to go to gaming. Are you okay with it? What that did was it gave us explicit permission and signal from the customer, not just to collect their data, but to use data from one service to the other. And they could always say no and get recommendations that didn't make much sense, but that was a choice the customer made. The big benefit to that is historically, before my team built the service, when we went from one app to the other within the Meta platform, we had to delete data if the consent didn't come. So essentially, you could have a situation where the customer wanted to have the data. So as an example, when you go from marketplace to dating, as an example, if you like shopping for dog food, if you like shopping for cat food, you might want to go on a date with somebody who's also an animal lover, right? So the platform grows and becomes better when people understand exactly why they're on the platform and what information can be used from one app to the other. So my team built that consent platform that drove up engagement for both services, in this case, gaming and dating. So what happened was the consent platform was built from a privacy perspective, but it essentially served a purpose that was totally different from privacy. So one technique I would recommend to build a culture of privacy is you want to build privacy solutions that serve other goals as well. So if you are doing the right thing by privacy, you're probably making the platform nimble, improving the quality of data, creating a culture of customer transparency. So if you can make the case that investments in privacy can help you make the business better and smoother, that's going to help build a culture as well. Because in that case, you're going to have engineers come to you more directly and say, hey, I have this use case. Can you give me a solution that achieves privacy goals and these additional goals as well? So you want to make sure that rather than saying no because of privacy, you say yes, we can build this tool that will help privacy and also achieve these other goals. So if you can create that culture of collaboration on an ongoing basis, that would be pretty fantastic. So that's my example. Anything to add, Brendan, before I move to the next question? Happy to give you the last word.
No, I don't think I have anything that no to add to that. No.
Awesome. So Tess comes up with another question here. Tess, thank you so much for being one of our most active questioners. I love people like you. So building a culture of privacy starts at the top. Board of directors, exec team, and others all live and breathe it to ensure that it remains front of mind for our employees. In short, a robust privacy program is a competitive advantage, particularly in the aggressive sales-driven SaaS companies. Brandon, I would love for you to take a first bite at this. I have some
Sure.
thoughts of my own as well on Tess's second question.
And I'm sorry, I'm not. I'm gonna look at the Q&A real quick. I'm not sure that I
Sure.
understood the question.
It's
Um,
8:23 second Q&A.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll respond to it. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, we need executive sponsorship. It is really hard to uh, drive privacy compliance or beyond compliance, drive your company to embrace privacy if they're getting conflicting messages from leadership. And so, yeah, I mean, I think um, you need executive sponsorship. And then on the other hand, using privacy as a competitive advantage, I think is really important. And I think it's a really compelling argument to make too. If you're looking to make the argument to say your marketing colleagues, you could say, look, this is where the market is. These are the tools that they're making that enhance the customer experience. Like we want to be a market leader in our industry when it comes to offering, a manageable, say, consent solution or something like that. So, yeah, I think it's a really good point.
And I agree as well. One thing I would add to everything you said, Brandon, is the fact that you need some degree of repetition. Like there's a line in The West Wing when Sam Seaborn, who's Rob Lowe, played by Rob Lowe, says to his colleague that all we're doing is preaching to the choir, and his colleague says yes, because otherwise they'll forget how to sing. So when you talk to the board of directors, when you talk to the exec team, it is very critical to ensure not just the cost and the effort of privacy. A lot of people do that to this day. They talk in slogans. Privacy is a human right. Privacy is critical. I'm not disagreeing with that at all, but you have to make it very clear to the board that here is the value proposition. Here is a new market we were able to get into because of privacy. Here is a merger or an acquisition that may have failed were it not for privacy, right? So you have to demonstrate that privacy is important for the business because, again, if you do privacy purely from a jurisdictional enforcement perspective, you don't see the benefit because people are going to say, oh my goodness, this is a lot of work and we didn't really make any dent to the customer experience, or we were not really changing anything. I've had a lot of engineers tell me that they push back on privacy not because they don't believe in privacy, but because they don't see the value. They don't see anything meaningfully change. So when you demonstrate to the board of directors that, hey, we made this privacy deletion solution, we were able to track things a lot better, and as a result we deleted data much faster, and the risk of breach went down, the risk of this data mistakenly being accessed by a third party went down, and as a result we were able to get into a European market. If you can tell that story, that is pretty critical because the board of directors are extremely busy, and my sense is, and I've been in many of those meetings at multiple companies, they say yes to privacy, they say yes to security, they say yes to growth, they say yes to interoperability, and sometimes everything that they say yes to cannot be compatible with each other. So it is critical for people to understand that when trade-offs have to be made, when you have to make choices, privacy is a good trade-off to invest in, because when you invest in privacy, you are achieving other business goals as well. So make sure that you repeat yourself over and over again. And I give people the example of Nike. Nike's marketing budget is higher than the GDP of certain countries in the world. So if the world's most famous brand has to spend money marketing its shoes and bras, surely the folks who work in privacy and security understand that marketing privacy is important as well. Because if people don't see the value proposition, they will forget, but they won't forgive, and you will be on the chopping block. So it is extremely critical. Don't think of privacy just as a cause or a first principle. It is those things, but think of it as a product. Think of it as a feature. It has to be justified just like anything else the company spends money on. Okay,
Yeah,
we have
yeah, I
one
think
more
that's right.
question.
Yeah, sorry,
Brandon,
go
let's
ahead.
go
Yeah,
first.
go ahead.
Why don't you go ahead, Brandon? Let's finish.
I was gonna say, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think you cannot look at privacy as the argument or the lever that you try to pull can't just be that it's the right thing to do, or it's, this is what we need to do to comply with the law. You need to frame it as something that adds value, that is a differentiator, that is business enabling. I mean, I think there's a lot of arguments where privacy helps the business.
Yeah, and I would basically, that's a fantastic point. I would basically say that, historically we've gotten into this mold where there is a law coming or there's an enforcement coming and we say do XYZ because of the law. And what Brendan is suggesting and what Tess has mentioned here is that if you can make these investments pay off and you can demonstrate that they have added value, you can make the case preemptively that, hey, we have done this thing and therefore this law is okay with us, right? There is no easy way to prove 100% compliance until you're actually audited. But if you can make the argument that this particular software
Sure.
change and this particular investment made this XYZ better, you can then make the case when you get assessed, and hey, look, we have this investment already in place. So rather than building for the law, you can have the law adapt to the work you've done. Because it's early in the game, folks. It's 9 o'clock in the morning from a privacy perspective. So rather than taking these laws as sort of immutable, unchangeable, or inflexible, you should make the case that your investments are essentially a personification of the law that is being passed right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. One thing that we've argued, to use a cliche, is that by investing in our privacy function and building robust controls globally, we're future-proofing the company against future regulations. And so, like, when something comes down the pike, we're already ready for it. We're already doing it. And I think that's been really compelling, because you could say that in a way, your investment has um, you know, prevented some reactive compliance costs that come when you're scrambling to try to comply with the law, engaging outside counsel, doing things that are pretty expensive. So
Awesome. Well, and what typically happens in the webinar, folks, is that people come up with questions and ideas. So Brendan and I had a script coming in, but as it often happens the case, our audience kind of takes over and asks questions. So we have another brilliant question from Swati Papuri. How is tracking privacy incidents different from tracking security incidents? What metrics should be taken into consideration when tracking privacy incidents? You want to go first, Brendan?
yeah, it's a good question. We treat them the same. So within Morningstar, we treat privacy incidents as we use the same ticket that we use for security. It's just a different subtype. So the same team manages it. We collect a lot of the same data about the incident. But the only difference is that if there's a privacy incident, my team gets involved as well. So we're not necessarily involved in the resolution of the incident, especially if it requires some sort of technical response. But we'll be involved to make sure that we meet all of our obligations under law, contract, what our customers expect, what have you.
Yeah, that's a terrific answer. So I'll just add to that to say that, when it comes to tracking, security often gets extremely noisy and security has to calibrate their alerts accordingly. So during my time at Netflix, as an example, and I believe we have people in the webinar right now that work at Netflix right now, but we were consistently being threatened by gangs all over the world when we ran movie content that went counter to their values. So as an example, when we had a documentary about the Russian bicycling doping scandal, it was totally based on full facts, etc. There was no editorial commentary at all. These were athletes who basically said that they were forced to take performance enhancing drugs. We were threatened with like DDoS attacks by Russian cyber gangs. Okay. And so all of our alerts were heavily geared towards DDoS attacks, account takeover, etc. And what happened is what they were doing is taking over accounts that were free accounts and streaming with those accounts, essentially trying to take over our bandwidth to make it look like people are streaming accounts. And then they were canceling those accounts to make it look like Netflix was bleeding customers. The goal was not to bring the service down from an operational perspective, but from a reputational perspective to make it look like we were losing customers left and right. So the big, in my mind, difference between privacy incidents and security incidents is that from a security incident perspective, it is typically one thing you're trying to prevent. You're trying to prevent one thing that could make other things go wrong. In the case of privacy, everything could look perfectly okay, but when all of those things come together, there is a risk to the business from a reputation perspective. So you are checking for different things at different velocities. So I would say treat the alerts all the same, but also look a bit deeper, because sometimes something that is a security risk may not be a privacy risk and vice versa. So if you're losing IP or content that belongs to the business, like board meeting notes, etc., that may not be a privacy risk, but that is a security risk. But at the same time, if you're losing data to an ad network, that may be totally okay from a security perspective, but what they're going to be doing with the data may violate privacy concerns. So take the alerts as a common starting point, but recognize that for security, you may not need to go as deep because it's a more mature discipline and the targets are more known. But from a privacy perspective, the risks may often show up years afterwards when it becomes very hard to fix and the headlines become much more punishing. So that's something else to think about. So what halfway in, Brandon, I'm going to take a bit of a pivot and say, what does relationship building look like? What have you seen to be more effective? Do you typically work your way from the top down, that is talk to the VP of engineering, the CTO, etc., get a mandate from them and talk with the engineers then? Or do you build bridges with the engineers first and go to the CTO as sort of a group together and say, give us spine? So what typically works well one way or the other?
I'm not sure that one works better than the other. I think you need both. My experience is probably a little bit different because I've grown within this company. And so my relationships were with the more junior people. And so I built relationships with the product people who are not necessarily the head of product, or the folks in InfoSec who aren't necessarily the CISO. But at the end of the day, you also need sponsorship from those people, being the head of product or revenue or CISO or what have you. Yeah, I mean, I think as far as relationships go, you need to understand what their interests are and make sure that they understand that you're here to help them achieve their objectives, as well as as well as whatever ask that you're making of them. I also, just on a personal level, like, want to be resourceful to these folks, and so it's kind of a I help you, you help me type thing.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed is that I have seen a lot more success working with individual engineers, because particularly in this day and age, when the management layer is under threat like never before. As some of you may have heard, just a few days ago, Amazon had a press release that they're making everybody come back to the office 5 days a week, which is essentially RTO completely end to end without any exception, unless it's a rare case. But they also had in the same press release they're going to be shrinking management ranks by 15%. So managers are losing jobs pretty quickly across the industry these days. That's something that is happening across the board. So you are likely to see a lot more churn on the management side. So if you depend upon the top-down mandate, you may end up getting that support from the manager, but they may not be around much longer, or they may not have the clout with the engineers. On the other hand, if you go bottom up, what I've seen, again, this is a Silicon Valley thing, or the West Coast thing, if you will, is that when you have engineers buy into your privacy vision, they will essentially stick with you a lot longer, because those habits and relationships are very, very hard to change. So if you can identify software engineers who may not have reports, who may not have like management layer powers, but they have a lot of credibility within the company. You always have in every company those particular engineers, data scientists who have been with the company a long time, who understand the infrastructure a bit better, who may not have documentation, but all the information lives in their head and by way of tribal knowledge. And if you can get them on your side, they can essentially ensure that your privacy concerns are in the discussion during planning, road mapping, testing, etc. So you want to make sure that you don't optimize purely for titles, because if you do it for titles, you will essentially be vulnerable to those titles going away. Something else I'll mention is the engineers are often risk vectors themselves. A lot of engineers are used to essentially moving fast and breaking things. So they often use free software, they often use free licenses, etc. And that's how untracked software gets into your company. And because it's not tracked correctly through the certification acquisition process, it is often outside the reach of scanning software as well from a security perspective. So building those relationships bottom up is extremely critical as well. So I would say Brandon is completely right. Top down is great, bottom up is great, and you have to essentially pick and choose which one works well for what situations, and do a bit of both. Anything to add there,
I'll
Brandon?
also say that, yeah, I'll also say that those engineers are going to be your best friend if you have a thorny problem that you need to solve. Say, for instance, you don't know where data lives for a DSAR or something like that. You're working on a deadline. You need to find the person who can help you solve this problem. And those engineers are going to be the people who help you.
Awesome. So before I move on to my next question, any other questions from the audience in Q&A before I ask my, oh, I see one more question coming. Okay, so this is Tess having an intramural conversation with Swati. I'm going to just read it briefly for folks to paraphrase. So the tracking of incidents, be privacy and security, should be outlined in your incident response plan. Most privacy incidents require speedy responses. In many cases, you may have to notify of incidents or even suspected incidents within 24 hours. Therefore, you need to have a detailed IRP and conduct tabletop exercises to practice your response protocols. This is an excellent point. I love the last line. I think people often look down on security and privacy training because it seems very, very theoretical. But I love the idea of tabletop experiments because it creates the scenario in real life. I remember I had a friend who works in the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in DC, and she said that a lot of the initial struggles they had during COVID was because it had been a long time since there had been a pandemic at that scale. And what they now require is a tabletop exercises every single week or so to make sure that if there is a pandemic or a leak or something, how do we react? How do we pull out the vaccines? How do we get people tested? How do we communicate? I think the loss of that muscle is extremely dangerous because you can have the software, you can have the relationships, have the meetings and the protocols, but if you don't practically put them into motion, it is very hard to see what works and what doesn't. So, have you seen that happen a lot in the industry, Brandon? Like actual simulation tabletop exercises, and if so, what did those look like?
Yeah, we do them here. I mean, we have them on a couple levels. I mean, we have quarterly tabletops. Um, with between the information security and privacy teams, and we may bring in a certain business unit just so that they can get those reps. We also have executive or board level tabletops, which I think are a really excellent opportunity. One, to get leadership to understand the risks that we're working with here, but it's also just a great selling point for the privacy and information security functions to show all the work they put into being prepared.
Yeah, and one thing else I would mention is when you watch crime procedural shows on TV, they often say this story may bear resemblance to anybody alive or dead. It's totally coincidental, and we all know that's not coincidental. A lot of these shows very cleverly take something that happened in the real world and make a story out of it. I would encourage privacy and security to do the same thing. I would say if something bad happened to another company that has the same kind of business as you guys or the same culture as you, maybe apply that as your tabletop exercise. Because honestly, if it could happen to, for example, Chase, it could happen to Bank of America as well. If it happens to Tufts University Hospital, it could happen to Stanford Hospital as well. So people always believe that something bad will happen just to them or just to their competitors. It could happen to anyone. So I feel like there is no shame in admitting that. And I think learning from somebody else's mistakes is a heck of a lot better than learning from your own mistakes because those mistakes hit you in the face pretty hard. So I would say definitely have tabletop exercises, have these incident response plans, have these protocols in place, but reconcile those with actual tabletop exercises because unless you put them in action, unless you actually run them in real life, it's very hard to understand, do these protocols actually work? Do people have the right tools? Are people communicating clearly? Because there is no substitute for real life experience. Like it's one thing if you watch a video on YouTube on how to switch your tires, that's one thing. But if you are on the side of the road and it's like raining and snowing badly and visibility is bad, that video may not help you change the tire unless you actually change the tire yourself. I have experience in this one, so trust me, you cannot learn how to change your tires by just looking at a YouTube video. So I would say practice, 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 and you'll get close to perfection in this case. I see a smile, Brandon. Anything to add there?
I smelled about the anecdote about tires. Yeah, no. I mean, I think that's right, and I think it's also that tabletops are just a really good opportunity to test and poke holes in your readiness, because you are inevitably going to expose things that on paper look right, but when you have all the stakeholders in the room and you're trying to make a decision, just don't work. And so, yeah, I do tabletops often.
Awesome. And as we get to the end of the webinar, we still have about 15 minutes to go. My last question always is, how do you make the case for the ROI? Because we've talked a lot about how privacy can help the business make better and whatnot. How do you communicate to the business that there is a return on investment that can be quantified, not just preventing something bad from happening down the road that could have happened otherwise? Because it's very hard to prove a counterfactual. It's very hard to say, if not for these privacy investments, we would have been fined $1 million. Like that's very hard to prove. Like things could happen, things may not happen, right? How do you
Yeah.
prove that we made these privacy changes? For example, privacy reviews, deletion, DSOR, data extraction, export, etc. We made these investments and they resulted in net savings or net profit of this much amount. Brendan, how do you go about identifying those improvements? How do you quantify them? How do you then evangelize them?
I think the honest answer is that it's hard. Privacy, um, especially on the compliance side, it's really hard to quantify. That said, we do our best, and so over time we've kept metrics on DSOR requests, response times when it comes to decel requests. We've gotten better recently about keeping data on transactions, who our clients are, what regions we're supporting, stuff like that. When I think it comes time to I identify our resource needs, that data has been really helpful. But otherwise, I think the story is I think ROI, and I'd love to hear your insight here, but I think ROI privacy is a challenging area to demonstrate ROI.
And let me give you some examples. I think hopefully
Sure.
people in the audience will reconcile with examples of their own. By the way, if people have examples on how they proved ROI for privacy, please add them to the Q&A and chat, if you will. But let me give you my perspective. During my time at Netflix, we routinely had situations where the big fear we had was customer loss. At the time, Netflix didn't have original content. The only revenue source for the company was essentially the subscribers who were paying on a monthly basis. So the big concern was, oh my goodness, we're going to lose subscribers and it's going to be terrible. So what we typically did at the time was we had every time somebody paid with us, we kept that credit card on file. Now it's become very common now, but back then the idea was the reason we have all these credit cards on file is if the customer forgets to update a gift card or a credit card bounces, we could charge them on a different credit card. The goal was if you were to email the customer and say, give us your credit card again because the last one failed, they may not add the data because they'll forget or they'll be like, okay, I was going to cancel Netflix anyways. Why should I now go in and add a credit card and you'd lose customers? So the company was being very defensive, but the problem is we had examples where people are pissed off at us saying, why did you charge a credit card that I had entered like 2 years ago? And the reason we had done that as a company is because their current credit card was maxed out or something. So it was great from a business retention paranoia perspective, but it was a terrible customer experience and it felt pretty icky. So what we essentially did was we said, we're going to tokenize every credit card except for the one that is currently being used. Okay. And what we did was rather than delete those cards, we tokenize them. Rather than making them available to everybody, we tokenize them. So what that meant is on a given day, if a customer couldn't pay because their current card was maxed out or expired or didn't work or whatever, we would send them a note saying, hey, we're going to charge you because it's the monthly billing time, but we're going to use this old card instead. So we didn't require an action for them unless they wanted to physically come in and cancel the account preemptively. So what that did was it gave us better security for those credit card details. It made the payment billing page much smoother and better and less crowded with a bunch of cards all at once. And it gave the customer the sense that Netflix was secure enough in its own skin that we didn't just charge cards willy-nilly. We were going to give the customer a chance to say yes or no. So that was an example of better security, better customer workflow, better transparency, and better privacy all at once. And what we saw was on a month-on-month basis, the customer loss numbers dropped dramatically when the cards declined. Initially, we were seeing that when a customer's card declined, there was a 75% chance that the customer would just not come back. We saw over the span of the next 6 months, those decline numbers went from 75% to 15%. Now, you could make the argument that that improvement by 600% was not just privacy. The economy got better, Netflix had better shows, etc. So there were a bunch of reasons, but it is undeniable that that privacy change made the UI experience much, much better. Because if people feel like we're going to collect their cards and hoard that data to charge them again and again, that's just icky. I wouldn't like it if somebody did that to me. So if you can demonstrate that your privacy products have a front end and back end component to it, are doing things that the engineers would have to do anyways, and would essentially improve the customer trust and therefore retain customers more. If you can build that narrative, that is very, very helpful because that's a narrative that you will build not just as a privacy team, but as a privacy team, as an engineering team, as a PM team, etc. So you can again think of privacy as a business feature and a business driver. That is much, much better. It is, to Brandon's point, impossible to prove ROI purely privacy, but privacy plus something else, that's an ROI story waiting to be told. Okay. Something else from tests. Privacy benefits are often indirect. Test, we're going to get you on the panel the next time. You have all these ideas that are pretty fantastic. So companies can establish KPIs to measure the success of a privacy program, but efficiency gains, reduction in incident response time, excellent examples. Fernando, let's put a screenshot of this in the privacy engineering channel as well, but Tess makes an excellent point here. GDPR fines, but are over and above that, efficiency gains, faster response times, customer retention, acquisition, etc. So when you can demonstrate that if everything else held constant produces XYZ gains, but with privacy thrown in, your XYZ plus 10 gains, that extra 10 points could be privacy. So make the argument. I would rather make the argument for privacy with and share the credit with 50 other teams than make the case purely based on privacy and not have any credit to share at all. So I would say be generous, be collaborative, be narrative, be story focused. Because remember, you need not just metrics, but a message as well. Because if you have metrics but no message, people are going to forget. if you have message but no metrics, people are not going to believe you. So you need both. Okay, as we get to the end, Brandon, my last question to you this time for real is, what message would you give to people who are either getting into privacy for the first time or have been in privacy for a while as their careers develop further? Like, what lessons can you give to both of those cohorts to succeed, become more effective, and become more effective in their job?
Yeah. Um, I guess for people who are looking for different roles or more responsibility or anything like that, I mean, I think the easy answer is just keep building skills, whether it be through certs or softer skills like management skills, stuff like that. For people within organizations, I mean, I think the I think probably the hardest thing in this role, just because it does not fit neatly within one silo, is getting things done across different functions within a company. And so I really think you need to be ambitious and getting out there and meeting people and encouraging your colleagues to help you with the privacy function. And on the flip side, you need to show them that it's worth it for them. And so you need to understand what makes them tick, what their, how their business measures success and what you can do to help them too.
Awesome. And I will add by saying that when you get used to sending these messages, you become better as a company as well. One of the biggest mistakes companies make, and I include not just Silicon Valley bottom-up companies, but even more legacy companies like WebMD, like Nike, like Morningstar. It is very hard to quantify and document stuff. Like, people move on from one crisis to the next because everybody's busy. There's always stuff happening. But it is important to capture these things in writing. Of course, work with your legal team, because what you don't want to do is create artifacts that could become discoverable when they aren't ready to be. So work with your legal team there, but having documentation as to here's what things used to be. Here's how we got together as a team to build these things better. Here's how we built an actual solution. Here's how we deployed that solution. Here are the numbers before and after. So when you have that narrative, it gives you a sense that privacy is not just available as a risk vector, but it is also available as a product feature and making the company better. And having those metrics means that you can hire better people, you can have a better response time, you can train people better. Because remember, once you have that culture, to Tress Frazier's point, it gets much better. But that culture doesn't just come top down. That culture has to be bottom up as well. When you have these artifacts written down, that lesson will be a lot better for you than just top down edicts. When I wrote my book, for example, 2.5 years ago, I was on a book tour and I talked to multiple agencies in the government, multiple companies on off the record rules. But in each of those cases, people told me what they loved about my book and my training was not just the details we gave them on the engineering side, not just the interpretation of the law that I was able to give them, but the practical examples, things that I did in my career that worked and things that didn't work. When you give people those examples, when you give people those stories, that will stick in the memory a lot more and will give people a clear sense of what works and what doesn't a lot more as well. So you want to really invest in that, because it'll make things better, not just for you, but for the next people who do the job that you're doing as well. Just as when you write your tests in high school, your professor says, don't just give me the answer, show me the work. This is the show me the work portion. And remember, when you tell a story, when you document things correctly, you are not just capturing it for posterity. You are essentially making sure that you understand what exactly happened correctly as well. And when you do that, it's a way to sort of like get better at your job across the board, regardless of your privacy or security or engineering. So that's the okay. With that being said, we're in the closing throes of this. Any other questions for the audience before I hand it back to Brandon to wrap this up? Because I'm going to just kind of begin winding down the call, and if people have questions, we'll take them up as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we have a software engineering, privacy engineering community on Slack. Please ping Hernando. Hernando, please send the link to that information as well. It's already on the webinar chat. Please join our community. It's a way for us to ask questions, answer questions, help each other out, get jobs, raise VC money. It's a very, very nice mix of people. It's not just attorneys or engineers, it's a bit of both. So please join our community. If you are interested in the webinar in being a panelist, please ping Hernando or Suhas or me. We're happy to add you in. But also, when you leave this call, take this memory with you and tell your colleagues in industry, tell them that we exist. We're happy to sort of like, we get our audiences, we get our topics from people who attend these events, and it helps people do their jobs better. The goal is not just to essentially have a webinar, but to build a community that'll help you do your job more effectively. So please help us help yourselves, and that will make us all better at our jobs. Anything to add, Brendan, before I call Hernando in?
No, that's it. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Hernando, back to you.
Well, thank you, folks. That's all from our end. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining from wherever you came from. And thank you very much, Brandon, for joining us, and Nishant. We'll love to see you again next month. We'll be having another presentation bring other professionals, privacy leaders from diverse organizations. So we hope to see you next time.